A specter haunts the Western world. Right-wing populists from America to England to Hungary and beyond are chanting the creed of nationalism and sovereignty, cries perhaps not seen in almost a century. The modern liberal order across the Western world is shaken to its core. First Brexit, then the election of Donald Trump, a surge in anti-immigration parties, the collapse of mainstream centrist party dominance, and the second election of Donald Trump. Why is this happening? Who are these national populists, and why are they upset? Today, we will begin to answer those questions. Today, we will explore the new ideology that has taken the global right and the world by storm. Today, we will discuss National Conservatism.
Very dramatic introduction, Mohammed. But welcome all our listeners. Welcome back to the Winter of Discontent podcast. I'm your host, Jackson.
And here's Mohammed.
And as you can imagine from the very dramatic introduction, we are beginning our dive into the new ideology that has really shaken up the American right, National Conservatism. In this 5-part series, we're going to try to understand the ideology and worldview of National Conservatism and its unique and pretty radical break from mainstream politics. We're going to look at the political platforms they espouse, their grievances, and their criticisms of the status quo, and how they've influenced or perhaps driven Trump's MAGA movement and its political programs and policies. We're also going to try to examine how they influence broader conservative spaces and what the significance of national conservatism is and what it heralds for America's political future. Each of these episodes are going to be about 30 minutes. Around half to 2/3 of the episode are going to consist of our informative content about the subject, and the last half or last third is going to be a discussion between me and Mohammed where we conduct or try to conduct at least an insightful analysis of that content. So let's get right into it and begin our first episode. What is National Conservatism, the ideology behind MAGA? Mohammed, do you want to lead off talking a little bit about what the worldview of National Conservatism is, just for people who aren't aware? Because it is pretty different from a lot of the more traditional conservative stuff that we've talked about earlier on this podcast, especially very different from libertarianism.
No, definitely. I think, we should talk about the worldview of nationalism, national conservatism. And I think we should start out then with a definition of national conservatism. It's also sometimes called national populism or nationalist populism around the world. National conservatism can be defined as an ideology that believes that the goal of politics is the maintenance of the nation or the nation state and its singular group of people. So national conservatives, unlike maybe libertarian conservatives or more free market conservatives or traditional conservatives, tend to emphasize heavily how the nation is the primary construct from which we should understand what is good for society and for individuals. We need to maintain the health of the nation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. The nation is the primary driving factor. And of course, I mean, I think a lot of people will say, well, is this really that unique? I mean, most people would say that the country is important and that, you know, some degree of patriotism is good. But this is, with national conservatism, it's a step beyond just patriotism and a more embrace of nationalism, or really sort of seeing the nation as the primary source of belonging for all people in the country. That's really what makes it distinct from maybe just a broad sort of more normal understanding of what patriotism is. Another interesting thing that sort of comes out of this is that national conservatives see the nation as like a single entity that represents everybody within the country. Now, you might say, isn't there a lot of like internal, you know, diversity within a country and a lot of different sort of voices? National conservatives would say that a nation should speak with a primary voice, and although there might be disagreements within the country, those disagreements should be kind of rendered subordinate to a single dominant narrative of what a nation is, what its history is, and who the nation is for. And that
Mhm.
last question, who the nation is for, leads to a lot of the sort of confluences with nativist elements within the political system that you see within national conservatism. This sort of belief that the
Mm.
country is by and for a single group of people. And a big thing that they'll ask, and the big thing that we're going to ask and look into is, who are those people? Who do they think the nation belongs to? And where does that leave everybody else who falls outside of that vision?
Right. And going on from what Jackson said there, and I know we'll go into more detail, but I think we'll need to have the listeners understand that for national conservatives, there's definitely a sliding scale of how nativist or ethnic centric national conservative thinkers are when they try to conceptualize who belongs to this nation. So maybe it's a particular ethnic group at one extreme to maybe, okay, maybe anyone who ascribes to common values. We'll definitely talk more about this, but this is definitely one of the most unique aspects to national conservatism that you don't quite see amongst maybe other Republican or conservative movements of the last few decades. So their tendency towards a serious, harsh form of nationalism and maybe leaning into a very identitarian conception of who belongs to that nation.
Yeah, and we've said like nation this, nation that. We've probably said nation like a million times in the last like 2 minutes.
Right.
Don't worry, we'll be saying it a million more times the next half hour. But you might say, okay, well, why do they care so much? Like, why care about the nation over maybe like another thing like religion or ethnicity or so and so or region? If you ask NatCons why they care about the nation, they'll say the nation is the most resilient common institution present within a country, and that it provides security and benefits and a sort of unifying identity to the people within a country, and that it's actually protecting people. Yoram Hazony is a very prominent national conservative thinker from Israel, and he wrote a very influential book called The Virtues of Nationalism. And one of the things that he points out in his defense of the concept of nationalism is he says that the nation state protects the unique cultures of the world, and it's sort of the best way to ensure that minority groups get representation is to give them their own nation and not have them be subordinate to these larger multi-ethnic states. It's sort of believed that if each of these groups can control their own destiny in their own countries, then they
Mhm.
can preserve themselves going into the future, and that therefore that actually contributes to diversity in the global sense by giving everyone their own little safe zones that they can grow
Mhm.
and preserve their culture in.
Right. And not only does it provide each group of people or ethnic group their own sort of safe, place and, state to protect them, but it also provides a sense of like community and identity that NatCons would say are inherent, inherent to human nature. Like people desire, solidarity with their fellow man, and the nation provides sort of like really big community for everybody. I think from here we can turn towards national culture as an important part of national conservative ideology. And for reference for listeners, sometimes we'll call national conservatives NatCons for short. So just to clear up any confusion here. But from back to the ideology here, national conservatives, obviously, their ideology is, the promotion of the nation state, right? And their belief, though, it doesn't just say like, oh, we just need to have this like form of government, but this government and this state, this nation can only survive if the nation's culture is defended. So this leads them to actively defend and promote, whatever the nation's religion is, the nation's traditional, socially conservative sort of culture. So like, general conservative political positions, and maybe whatever the local customs, traditions, unique lifestyles, tastes, and beliefs of that nation are. So defending the culture of the nation is necessary to defending, the nation as a whole. It cannot survive if its culture is not conserved.
Yeah, that's true. That sort of speaks to the importance of the sort of common and shared identity, and the belief, and I think we've said this before, that there is one tradition, sort of one people that a country is supposed to represent, that a country is supposed to, be for. And oftentimes there'll be a tension within national conservatism versus like how much, to what extent are sort of like local communities taken into consideration, especially when they might have conflicts with that like national vision. Like maybe a region has unique cultural customs that only they have that aren't present in the rest of the country. And there is sort of a tension there between some of the NatCons who will say, well, we can maybe, you know, give some more leeway within the country to certain traditions versus others who will say, no, we have like the United States, for example, has one culture, one way of doing things. If you don't do that in the way we want you to, then you're not really American, or you're sort of not really following the national culture, or you're creating divisions. That is a sort of continued question within national conservatives. But even the ones who will maybe prize regional cultures more, or the ones who will be more okay with more pluralism within the country, will still say that ultimately everyone kind of needs to be on the same page about what the nation actually is and who it's for.
Right. And I think from there, we can also kind of understand that there are definitely degrees of radicalness within the national conservative space. There are people who, as we consider more mainstream right-wing populist national conservatives. Maybe in America, I guess leans more towards like mainstream Republican Party, or maybe in like Britain, this is like Farage. These are people who are, yes, we would consider like, oh, we need to defend the nation's culture and its heritage and its people, but maybe we don't necessarily think it's a super nativist conception, like only white people allowed. Maybe they might insinuate that, but they won't outright go that far. Then we might have like far right white nationalists who will adopt the language of national conservatism, saying we need to defend the nation and its culture and its people, but then they'll take it to another level and say only like white people, for instance, are part of the nation. And then we have another group of people we're going to talk about later, post-liberals, they're called. And we'll soon see, national conservatism has a lot to say or criticize when it comes to liberalism. And there are some national conservatives who take this critique, from a critique to an outright rejection of liberalism. And these people we call post-liberals, and are considerably more radical than the average NatCons, and oftentimes advocate authoritarian forms of government or a revolution to overturn the current status, like social, political, and economic status quo.
Yeah, it's sort of like you have your more moderate ones who will say, well, we just need to reform, the nation within the existing American tradition. And then your post-liberals will say the American tradition is corrupt or not sufficiently traditional, and we need to change that and replace it with something else. And this sort of focus on culture and ways of life, I think, leads us to a really important point that we're going to talk about continually through this episode. And we're going to take some time to explain it because I think it is a really important thing to understand, and a really important way in which national conservatism is different from liberalism and sort of the traditional way we think about how people are allowed to live their lives, or how they're supposed to live their lives. So national conservatives have this concept of what they like to call the good life, or like the good life conception of politics. This is a very particular conception of politics that states that there is essentially one correct way of living your life. It's not a matter of opinion, and it's not a matter necessarily of choice or how you're feeling at any given moment. They would say there are certain practices and certain things to do that are the correct way to live, that are objectively better than other ways to live, and that objective correctness should be recognized by the government, and the government should attempt to push that particular way of life onto people, regardless really of how they think about it. It's viewed sort of as morality is viewed more as a fact of life rather than as a question that people could have a reasonable disagreements on.
Right. And I think that is actually the heart of what differentiates this good life conception of politics from what we'll talk about later, the liberal conception of politics. The good life conception of politics believes that morality must be enforced by the state on the people and society. And this takes us to perhaps the most important part of the good life conception, which means that this state takes an active role in enforcing morality. It ensures that there are correct forms of behavior amongst individuals and social groups, maybe banning certain things that this moral system dislikes, and maybe promoting or forcing people to engage in good moral behaviors. And therefore, we can really consider this good life conception of politics to be pretty anti-pluralist, or at the very least, only allowing a limited form of pluralism. Because, well, if only one conception of what is right and wrong is allowed by the state, then, well, there isn't that much leeway there, right?
Yeah.
So, right.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's sort of it's it's less a question of, you know, is what I'm doing legal or not, which is how a lot of, a lot of how our society kind of determines moral actions or thinks about moral actions. Basically, you're allowed to do what you want as long as it doesn't actively harm others. And if you want to live super traditionally, you can. If you want to live in a very sort of like avant-garde or like liberal way, then you can. Under a national conservative system, they would say it's not so much about legality so much as whether it's right or wrong. It's a question of morality, not legality. So, sure, maybe you don't hurt anyone by, for example, like being gay in a like liberal city or something, but they would say regardless of whether that hurts anybody or not, it's still wrong and it should be illegal, or at the very least socially discouraged. It's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of fact from their opinion or from their perspective.
Right. And we can kind of understand that this is the core difference here. National conservatives and good life, politics proponents believe people cannot choose their own form of morality, while people, a liberal conception of politics, which we'll get into shortly, believe you can choose what you want to do on an individual scale. But I think here maybe we should provide some examples, for our listeners. So yeah, they're thinking, okay, well, I don't really live in this like good life conception of politics. I live in like a Western country, probably in the United States. Which doesn't seem to align with this. So like, what is this good life conception of politics? Well, I mean, so before, the Enlightenment and before, liberal, democracies came around, most like Western European, Western countries lived under a traditionalist conservative form of, political order where there was an objective morality, like, belief that, Catholic Church and religion should be at the center of life. And that was enforced on people. Like you didn't have a choice of whether or not you could be a Christian or not in these societies. And like, like France, England, you didn't have a choice whether or not you could, if you wanted to not pay, the tithe to the church, you didn't have a choice on that, right? And we can kind of see the same thing with other like political ideologies that believe in a good life conception of politics. Like with communism or state socialism, there was a clear idea of what was good, right? Like a social order where, in theory, like the workers own the means of production, and capitalists, like private property, is banned, and loyal to the state was, enforced, right? So you couldn't deviate from that, right? And same with like, say, like fascism, where there was the good life conception of society was where a society obeyed the state, and that the state and the nation work towards a singular goal of like national advancement, and any sort of deviation from that was not tolerated, right? People had to pursue moral actions, I don't know, serving their country in the military, or businesses had to ensure that their production was working for the war industry of like Nazi Germany. Like these were huge interventions in society, ensuring that individuals work towards this quote unquote like common good.
Mm-hmm. And so naturally, sort of leading out of that, this means that ideologies that sort of believe in this idea of the good life are going to necessarily be more statist. They're going to be more interventionist in public life, and they're a lot less likely to be democratic in the way that we understand it. Because from their perspective, this does sort of make a degree of sense. After all, if you do believe that there is a singular version of the good life that has been revealed to us one way or the other, then democracy suddenly becomes something that's very dangerous, because it's
Right.
not about managing different conceptions of the good life. Now it's a contest between the truth, the good life as you understand it, which from the NatCon perspective is the only way to properly understand it. It's a competition between that and a series of like delusional beliefs that are spread either through ignorance or through deliberate malice by people who reject the truth and who reject the good life. So democracy is dangerous. The stakes are really, really high, and compromise becomes very, very difficult.
Hmm.
After all, if you genuinely believe, for example, let's say on the issue of abortion, that um, aborted fetuses are human beings, if you believe that, and you believe that like essentially millions of human beings are being murdered in an industrial like farming thing every single year, then people who go to you and say, well, you got to come up with a moderate solution to this and make some compromises, you would look at them with total disgust.
Right.
You would say, no, 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 this isn't a question of political expedience or not. This is a question of saving millions of human lives. And therefore, we're not going to compromise. And in fact, the whole system requiring us to compromise in the first place seems kind of dirty. Democracy seems like a potential trap in which people can be deceived and can move away from the good life, which is why there is this sort of sense that democracy is a thing that it can exist, but it needs to be managed to ensure that things don't really go off the rails.
Right. The more you feel like you need to enforce morality on the people, the more unlikely it is that you can compromise in a political arena with, people that disagree with your version of morality, and therefore democracy tends to be questionable. And I think there we can talk about the alternative conception of politics, the liberal conception of politics. And I think right off the bat, we need to quickly explain what we mean by liberal. So liberalism started out as an Enlightenment 18th century philosophy challenging the absolute right of kings and the traditional conservative beliefs of the time. It was an individualist philosophy that believed in what we call like negative rights, the freedoms or rights from government intervention, like right to like freedom of religion, right? Like I can choose my religion, the government can't interfere in that. Freedom of speech, the government can't interfere in that. So it's freedom from government intervention. And these people are these classical liberals that are coming around this time believe in, a market economy, free markets, and they like right wing economics, we could say in American terms. And they also believe in like social freedoms, like left wing, like social beliefs. They think like people should be able to choose what they want to do in their private life. And this becomes a dominant philosophy across much of the Western world throughout the 19th century. But as the Industrial Revolution advances, and that causes a lot of dislocations, some liberals, classical liberals, still arguing from the individual standpoint of rights, individual rights, start to take issue with this and say, hey, wait a minute, it doesn't matter if I have freedom from government intervention, to choose what kind of religion I want when I can't eat food and I don't have a house and I can't afford healthcare, things like that. So they started arguing for positive rights. So freedom to have healthcare, freedom to have housing, and things like that. And that's social liberalism. And that's like, think FDR, New Deal, LBJ, Obama, right? So Democratic Party, right? But some of these classical liberals didn't like go away. There was actually a resurgence of these classical liberals around the 70s and 80s. We call this neoliberalism, but it's really just repackaged classical liberalism. And this is associated with the Republican Party. So really, both the Democrats and the Republicans are liberal parties, just different interpretations of liberalism. So this is what we mean by liberal. We mean an individualist philosophy that generally allows people to choose how they want to live. There are just different interpretations of how to do that.
Yeah, and the sort of the different interpretations is a key part of liberalism, because a big part of liberalism is pluralism, both pluralism of viewpoints. You have freedom of speech, you can say what you want, and sort of necessarily arising out of that is a moral pluralism, a belief that within the bounds of the law and within the bounds of perhaps common decency, you can have different understandings of what's good in life, what's worth pursuing. If you want to live a super traditional lifestyle, then you can. If you don't want to, then under liberalism, it's also okay to not do that. They would say morality is such a contentious issue, and it's such a divisive one that ultimately the state can't decide that
Mhm.
one group is right and that one group is wrong. We have to establish a degree of pluralism, allowing people to choose what they want as long as it doesn't really hurt anybody else. And so essentially, the harm principle, or the sort of like do what you will as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else, becomes the kind of main liberal conception of morality.
Right. And I think there we can understand that most political parties throughout the Western world, at least especially since the end of the Second World War, and it's including the Democratic and Republican parties in America, are like ultimately liberal parties because they allow people to live, generally speaking, live their lives as they see fit. Yes, maybe Democrats take issue with someone who is, I don't know, like a businessman who is not treating their workers well enough, or is not being taxed enough. And maybe Republicans would take issue with, I don't know, like maybe someone's doing abortion, or maybe someone who is, I don't know, smoking weed or something like that. But generally speaking, the latitude of what is allowed, morally speaking, is pretty wide, especially compared to other societies around the world, and especially compared to our ancestors. And I think that leads to the last point we should understand: the liberal conception of politics, which is that the state under liberal conception of politics is seen as value neutral. The state does not promote a, objective morality on the people, and allows people to choose as they will. And that kind of jives very well with, democracy, diversity, and having different viewpoints, right? So liberalism and democracy generally are going to be paired together because of that.
Mm-hmm. And so national conservatism kind of lies somewhere in the middle between the liberal and the good life understanding of politics, but this represents still a shift towards the conception of the good life, in comparison, at least to the dominant like liberal ethos that's on the sort of traditional center left and center right today. So it is a critique of the liberal conception of politics, even if it doesn't go as far as, say, like communism or fascism do in terms of direct totalitarian mandate over citizens' thoughts and actions and worldviews. Like NatCons might say, yes, there's one that's correct and we ought to be pushing that, but you're never really going to hear them argue for anything approaching like actual fascism, essentially. We will talk about people who do advocate for stuff like that eventually once we get to white nationalists, but not for NatCons.
Right. Um, yeah. So as you can tell, national conservatism represents like a relative shift towards the good life, and a critique, implicit critique of the liberal order that we've generally lived in. They have some criticisms of the liberal conception of politics. The first critique is that liberalism for them is not seen as being a neutral system, like a value neutral, no bias towards morality, or, a form of morality or another. They vehemently disagree with that. And they instead believe that liberalism has its own ingrained preferences and biases. They would say liberalism has, and all liberal forms of politics have a bias towards like individualism. They're opposed to hierarchy. They're opposed to tradition. They're in favor of equality, innovation, and change. And they would also say liberalism's individualism as a penchant for, individuals choosing hedonistic lifestyles without any like moral guardrails. So clearly they have this belief that liberalism actually, no, it doesn't just allow people to choose whatever they want. Having liberalism means people are incentivized to go towards a particular sort of life that's very individualistic, pro change, pro equality, etc.
Yeah, I mean, they would say, look, the you liberals say that the state's neutral, it's not intervening, and it's letting people make their own decisions. But letting people make their own decisions, they would point out, is not a neutral position. That actually is liberal neutrality is actually a position in of itself. It's
Right.
saying that individuals are the primary social unit instead of like the family or the village or the church, and that the individual gets to just kind of decide to do whatever they want. And
Right.
that they would point out accurately that that's a very, very distinct notion from how most of human history has been lived. Traditionally,
Yeah.
you don't get to make those decisions, or at the very least, you're heavily constrained by the factors around you. And they would say
Mhm.
the liberal insistence that individuals get to do this is not neutral. It's actually a radical change from how humans have lived their lives for essentially multiple millennia. And that therefore, this means that the liberal state is not a sort of fair judge between all systems, that it's actually very biased. It wants to get rid of these traditional social systems, or at the very least,
Mhm.
it's going to create the conditions that will allow these like hierarchical systems to atrophy by saying it's okay for people to walk away from them. And
Right.
they get a lot of influence from a particular 20th century philosopher and legal theorist named Carl Schmitt, who was very famous for creating what he called the friend enemy distinction in politics. For Schmitt, who was writing during the Weimar Republic period in Germany in between the First and Second World War, he said, and he was critiquing sort of the Weimar era, like liberal culture and its constitution. He was saying the Weimar Republic was not a neutral system. It was not something that was giving people the opportunity to live however they wanted. He said the Weimar Republic, through its liberalism, through its pluralism, was trying to destroy the old Germany, like the
Mhm.
traditional Germany that had existed prior to the First World War. And that therefore, people who would claim that German conservatives were trying to weaponize the system and sort of unfairly operate, he would say those people are wrong, or they're wrong for making that
Mhm.
critique. They would say liberals already manipulate the system. They already use the system to destroy traditional culture. If conservatives use the state to attack liberal culture, that's not wrong. That's just called them fighting back. In his mind, there is no such thing as illegal weaponization of the state, because all political factions want to weaponize the state to their own ends. And those who complain that others are doing it are really pointing the finger at themselves, because
Mhm.
they're guilty of what they accuse others of doing. That's at least his opinion on it.
Yeah, that kind of understanding of liberalism not being neutral is going to be really key to national conservatives and national conservatives and their policies, and we'll explain why they attack, supposedly independent institutions. To give an example, I think the second critique we should give is by the post liberals, the people we briefly mentioned as being like basically more radical versions of national conservatives. They argue that liberalism is inherently flawed because it's absent. Basically, it doesn't have a view of what constitutes a good life. They would say liberalism says, well, you can live a life however you want. And they would say, well, hold up. That's like the most important question in the world. How do you live your life? And you have nothing to say about that, especially given that in their minds, humans need guidance. They would say that, humans don't have all the answers, and they don't have the godlike knowledge, and that if they aren't given guidance, then they will fail and be confused. So liberalism not having anything to say about living life is one of the major critiques that national conservatives and post liberals will have. The other one is, as we know, we kind of elaborated before, liberalism, they would say, is inherently it's basically just a vehicle for individualism and permissiveness. And these sort of belief systems, like, oh, I'm allowed to do whatever I want in my private life, basically means like you're not going to be beheld to any like common standards or common institutions or social belonging like religion or family or community, and you'll spurn these things. And that's unfortunate, they would say, because, well, those things are necessary for living a good life, right? The good life is, in their eyes, about religion and community and culture and things like that. And liberalism, just saying, oh, those things are optional, is a direct attack on those things.
Yeah, and they'll say that liberalism won't even let you have those things, even if you do freely choose them, because they'll say, okay, let's say me and a bunch of my conservative friends want to start a conservative homeschooling thing, and we want to teach our kids the way that we think is correct to live. Well, now the liberal state's going to be like, well, hold on, we got to send in inspectors to make sure you're not teaching them hateful dogma, or make sure they're getting all the right educational supplements, and you need to align them with our public school curriculum. And they'll say, hold on, wait a minute, didn't you say that we have the opportunity and the freedom to choose how we want to live? It seems that, the only people who have the freedom to choose how they want to live in your society are the ones who choose to live in a non-traditional way. They would say, you're
Right.
not operating as this neutral,
Hmm.
mediator. You want people to not live traditionally. You want them to be individualists. You want them to be atheists. You want them to be gay. You want them to bring in immigrants and use green energy, and you want them to do all these things, and you're pushing that through the culture. And meanwhile, you're putting all these restrictions on us. This isn't neutrality at all, they would say.
Right. I mean, I want to maybe one other example a lot of NatCons will say is like, look, in a liberal society today, you can choose, whether to spend all your time on your phone or on a screen, or you can choose whether or not to go to church or not, or you can choose whether or not to start a family or not. But the fact that it's optional and the fact that the state doesn't have a position on that means that people being, by nature, prone to choosing what is easy and self-gratifying will spurn these things and will decide to basically just spend their life, engaging in like rootless like hedonism and self-centered narcissism and spurn these like duties and obligations to these good life sort of practices as like religion, community, and family. So they say it's not real freedom. They would say like liberalism promote like says like, oh, we're not choosing that like hedonistic lifestyle. That's if only if you want to do it. But they would say the fact that you're letting people choose is a bias in favor of that choice because people by nature without a strong state or common ideology to force them or push them in that direction will choose the wrong option.
It's like leaving a pile of candy next to a child and being like, well, you have a choice on whether you want to eat it or not, and then getting surprised when the child chooses to eat all the candy and have a stomach ache. People could correctly say, well, sure, you said the child had a choice, but like you knew what was going to happen.
Right. So as you can probably understand, NatCons clearly have a at best contentious relationship with liberalism and liberalism's conception of the good life. And that's something we need to understand going forward in the next few episodes, that NatCons mark a dramatic shift away from this like live and let live sort of liberalism that's been common in Western societies. And they kind of push a kind of radically different pre World War II like sort of understanding, or even pre-modern understanding of what politics should be about.
Yeah. Yeah, and with that, I think we're going to move into the discussion portion of this episode. And one of the first questions that me and Muhammad had sort of thought to talk about when we were sort of drafting this is any of this actually compatible with like liberal democracy? Like, is national
Mhm.
conservatism an authoritarian ideology? Can you have it in a country that claims to be a liberal democracy?
Right. This is a big question. I think maybe starting out here, we're basically asking, can you have like the absence of moral pluralism in liberal democracy? Can you push or force or coerce or promote a certain conception of what is moral in a liberal democracy and still, still have the liberal democratic system around? And this is where I think this is very dubious. I think at best you could say that there's going to be some frictions and problems. And at worst, I think there's a general slide maybe towards autocracy. And I think simply saying, like going off of what we had said earlier about how, people who believe in the good life believe the stakes are basically too high to allow their morality to be subject to a referendum or a vote or a parliamentary vote, right? I think that's basically correct, right? Like if you really do think the stakes are so high for your good life conception, politics, if you really do think that you cannot let, your conception of morality must be forced on people. If it's really that important, well, why would you allow that, that choice to be up to a vote, right? The
Hmm.
logic and conclusion of this ideology is some sort of at least like some sort of like managed maybe democracy, or only allowing certain kinds of viewpoints, maybe like a hybrid regime. But maybe perhaps it's simply just an outright authoritarian regime.
Yeah, and it's important to note too, because I agree with that point fully. It's important to note too that it's almost a question of putting can you put the cat into the bag when it comes to moral pluralism as it already exists in most like Western countries. Sure, maybe you could say, let's say you have a country that's very, traditionalist, and everyone more or less shares kind of a similar sense of morality. This is like America basically before the 1960s.
Yeah,
Yeah, there are disagreements on certain social issues like prohibition and maybe like civil rights, but broadly speaking, the vast majority of people are Christian. If you ask them on like individual social practices, what they think is right and wrong, they're probably going to give pretty similar answers with maybe some
right.
differences. But we don't live in that kind of country anymore. Like we live in a country where you can ask someone from rural Texas what they think about like morality and abortion, and you can, or like gay marriage and things like that. You can ask someone from New York and they're going to have totally different answers, like
Mhm.
irreconcilably different answers. And so the question is going to be, in a country that already has this diversity of opinion, it doesn't seem to me like there'd be any way to really reconcile those differences outside of authoritarianism. Like if you decide you're not going to just let it be and let people have their differences, then and you're going to make them fight it out. Well, I mean, I don't see the either person from rural Texas or New York City willingly agreeing with the other person's perspective, absent of some sort of forcing mechanism
Mhm.
from the government making them do so.
Right. And like going off what you said, I mean, we kind of, if we think about it, why national conservatives feel the need to enforce their, conceptual morality quickly becomes an important question because there weren't any national conservatives before 19 like 60s in America because there didn't need to be, right? As Jackson mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
most people had a very similar conceptions of morality and what that was and had a common religion and things like that. So there's no problem, right? Like people genuinely lived the good life, right? And they lived that the national conservative like conception of a good life, like a mostly like like white, homogenous, like Christian sort of conservative society. But once there's this division in thought, between people who are clearly more liberal or progressive and those who are more traditionally conservative, then the necessity of national conservatism does come around from the national conservative standpoint because like, well, now we need to go back to the turn back the clock, and that means using the state, right? So ironically, the decline of the national conservative good life, like actually lived good life in America, necessitates for national conservatives the enforcement of their ideology. And as Jack said, I do think that's dubious. Like, I don't see like liberals just accepting, for instance, like, oh, now the national conservative government in DC is going to be like promoting their policies. They're going to like ban gay marriage. They're going to ban abortion. They're going to do all these things. I don't see like liberals just putting up with that, right? And I
Yeah.
see that causing a lot of like polarization and crisis. Now, I will say I don't think this necessarily means a full slide towards autocracy, but it does mean for national conservatives that as the country becomes more and more liberal, that option increasingly becomes more attractive, right? Because
Yeah.
what else? What other alternative is there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this sort of, speaking of this in like a wider context, and this is changing the culture, particularly changing the culture regarding what is viewed as like social norms or okay ways to behave, is you could say really the primary thrust of national conservative worldview. Do you think the culture can be changed? Like the liberal hegemony, or sort of like the liberal understanding of like, live and let live, don't mess with other people as long as they're not messing with you. That's been the dominant, like, common sense understanding of how to live your life, like in the liberal Western world since 1945. That hasn't really been seriously challenged until now. Do you think NatCons can do it? Like, do you think they can replace that with something else? I mean, I'll just say I don't think so, but I'm curious to hear your opinions on it.
Yeah, I'm skeptical as well. I think at least in the near term, I don't think that's really a possibility. And I want to show like an example of this just to illustrate my point here about why this is so difficult and how ingrained, as you could say, like, liberal hegemony is. So President Trump introduces liberation tariffs, about a year ago. And they came under a lot of criticism, this is raising prices, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, costing, consumers, right? And, the value of, the consumer and what the consumer can buy and, the freedom of the, the consumer to buy as he wishes is kind of seen as like a core like liberal like tenant, right? Like, core individual's tenant. And, Trump hit back and a lot of conservative commentators hit back in a way that you really haven't seen since maybe like Jimmy Carter, like criticizing like liberal, like sort of like consumerism. Like he said, like, if Americans can't buy like 10 dolls, for Christmas and they can only have like one doll, like that's worth it. Basically implying like there are certain values, good life values, like, national autonomy and national industry and maybe like manufacturing sector. Those things are more important than like being able to buy as much cheap stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that meant a lot of backlash, right? Like the tariffs are pretty unpopular and a lot of the tariffs were scaled back. I think most Americans clearly, like, I think like approval ratings on like the tariff issue is like underwater for Trump, right? And I think the fact that Americans are still kind of within the whole, like, as a consumer, I should be able to purchase the cheapest amount of stuff, no matter if there's a national interest or, the nation favors its industry. Like, if that sentiment is really still commonplace, I am very pessimistic for NatCons if they can really change the discourse around that.
Yeah, it's like, sure, you can pick on liberals for having certain unpopular social views, like, say, for example, like transgender sports or transgender individuals participating in high school sports. That is an issue in which liberals tend to be kind of against the grain of mainstream public opinion, at least. But when it comes time to like actually govern and you start putting massive tariffs on things and you start really trying to push like divisive social legislation on the national environment, it does seem that people have essentially no tolerance for that sort of thing. And this again kind of goes into the National Conservatives being skeptical of democracy because they would say, well, these things are good. Like, I don't care that you don't like them. Cool. Like, you're throwing a hissy fit because you got your toys taken away. But guess what? We need to do the tariffs. We need to ban abortion. We need to restrict immigration. We need to do all these things for your own good, really, and for the good of the country. And, you can sort of see an eventuality where, if these programs really do start to get unpopular and it looks like they're going to lose, NatCons will be like, well, like, shit, I'm not going to just leave office and let a liberal come in and ruin everything that I've worked so hard to do. I don't care if the people like it or not. Like, I'm essentially acting as a father figure. I know it's good for them, to quote what Tucker Carlson said about Trump, daddy's home and he's pissed. But yeah, to be like, okay, I'm not just going to like leave office. Like, no, I'm saving the country. I'm fixing everything. I'm making it all as it should have been. And if the people are idiots and decided to not listen to that, then frankly, that sounds like a them problem and not a me problem. I'm not going anywhere. And there is a national conservative governing record that I kind of want to talk about going off of this.
Right.
Yeah, like the Hungary example, I think is the best example of what does NatCon governance look like? Because for those who don't know, Hungary until very recently, as in like this year, was ruled by a national conservative party, the Fidesz party, under their leader Viktor Orban. I think, Mama, do you know how long Orban was prime minister for Hungary for? I think it might have been like 15 years.
Yeah, like 15 or 16 years, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a really, really long time. And so we have actually a pretty good record of, all right, you give NatCons 15 years, give them a country, give them a majority in parliament, and let's see what they got. And Mohammed, do you want to say maybe on what happened in Hungary and what that sort of says about NatCon ideology in practice?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, when Orban's, Fidesz party took power, he introduced a lot of reforms, right? Like he threw a lot of money at like childcare and, pro-natalist policies to encourage Hungarians to have more children. He took over a lot of independent like media and organizations in the country and a lot of independent sort of like government offices and used them to be like pro-government sort of like pro-government organs effectively. He like took over like the school education curriculum and transformed it to be more like pro like Christian and pro like Hungarian nationalist. and things like that. He also, presided over an increase in like corruption and, like crony capitalism, we might call it, enriching maybe many of his like friends. And he also meddled the electoral system and changed it to favor his party in elections. I used to call it gerrymandering. And I think from all of this, not debating like the merits of whether or not national conservatism is like true or correct or not. I think we can say, though, at least from this example, that quite frankly, that like liberal hegemony we were talking about, like liberal order that's existed in the last 80 years, seems to still be going strong because Hungarians generally like they didn't like really increase like the birth rate that much. Hungary didn't become like a more like Christian like country, like really like a lot of the attempts to make the country like more conservative kind of like fizzled out or didn't really deliver that much progress. And then a somewhat more moderate candidate ends up winning in 2026, was a little more liberal. So honestly, I think looking at the governance record, and I think we can look at America too, like I think the fact is that most people at this time, this day and age, just would are fine with people living their lives that they see fit, and they don't really want to force other people to live, life according to their rules.
Yeah, they got their opinions, but ultimately it's just too much work, frankly, to force everybody to live in accordance with your moral system. And it doesn't even seem like it would work. Like Russia's another interesting example of this because Putin, I mean, he's very authoritarian now, but when he started out, he was a lot more like a national conservative. Efforts to strengthen the Orthodox Church, efforts to boost the Russian birth rate, and sort of like re-emphasize traditional gender roles. And you can look at how Russia has turned out to see how well that all ended up. The birth rates have gotten worse in Russia. Russians are not more religious. Russia's like one of the most like atheist countries in the world, or one of the most like irreligious countries in the world. It doesn't seem like they've gotten more, more moral as a people, frankly. The corruption is still massively sort of infiltrating their economy. There's still problems with oligarchs. It seems that all NatCon governance did, even when you gave them absolute power under Putin, was to do a series of like flashy social programs, enrich regime allies, punish dissidents, but ultimately not do much more beyond that. So I don't think really that there's a very robust NatCon governance record, so to speak of, or at least not one that addresses the things that they claim are major concerns.
Yeah. I mean, I want to be clear, especially to maybe fans of national conservatism. We're not necessarily saying, national conservatism is like wrong as an ideology. We're not saying like, you guys got everything wrong. But I do want to mention that, it's not like there weren't any successes. Like Hungary and Orban did like restrict like illegal immigration dramatically. There was a bit like of an Orthodox Christian revival in Russia for at least a period. And there was like improvements on like, reducing like abortion and like reducing like divorce and things like that. It's just that compared to the expectations that these like leaders had set out for themselves, they clearly fell flat, I would say, by, according to what they had set out for themselves. And on the topic of national conservatism and its relationship to democracy, I mean, there is maybe one counterexample to the idea of national conservatism being inherently leading toward like democratic backsliding, like under Orban. And that's Meloni's Italy. Meloni is the prime minister of Italy, and she has been a national conservative, but she's governed in a way that seems more reminiscent of like a center right politician, where there hasn't really been like democratic backsliding, but she is still promoted like maybe more hardline conservative policies. So I think clearly like national conservatism doesn't necessarily have to be this sort of like illiberal democratic experiment. Maybe it can actually work within the confines of liberal democracy. The point is maybe more that national conservative definitely has an ambiguous relationship with liberal democracy.
Yeah, I'd push back on that a little though, because I would say the Maloney record would really, on what she actually ended up doing in office, she ended up just governing like a normal center-right conservative party. I remember when Maloney got elected, people were saying she has like neo-fascist origins in the Italian far right. You know, she's been somewhat like dismissive of the crimes committed by the Mussolini government during the Second World War. She might have fascist sympathies. I mean, judging by what we've seen so far, it doesn't really seem like any of that was true. I mean, Italy isn't a fascist state. They've not taken any steps towards being one. Frankly, like, yes, they have been, you know, hostile towards immigration, but so have a lot of European governments who are not national conservative. That's hardly something that's only the purview of national conservatives. They're currently in a coalition with a variety of other parties, some of which are definitely more to the center, some of which are farther right. It seems really that it's not that Maloney was a successful national conservative. I would say it seems that more Maloney just stopped being a national conservative and started governing like a member of the normal center right. I think going back to what we were saying earlier about the tension between having a very non-pluralist worldview and operating in a pluralist political system, you get asked a choice at a certain point of, you know, when the rubber hits the road, when you start losing and when you encounter setbacks, do you, you know, moderate your vision, or do you push forward and try to keep the vision pure, even if that means messing with the system? I think Maloney's definitely an example of a person who's moderated. And you could say this isn't so much a sign of successful NatCon governance so much as it is a rejection of NatCon government or governance in favor of just normal center-right policies.
No, I think that's a good argument to make. And maybe to round off the episode, I think in a broader sense, you know, it seems like I think Jackson and I are both are pretty skeptical of national conservative, you know, sort of good life conception of politics overturning the current like liberal, like, you know, pluralist conception of politics. But I'm going to add maybe like a personal note. I do think that, you know, personally, I think that it's possible that we could go towards maybe a more national conservative good life sort of politics. But this would only happen once, you know, the great majority of the people start to agree with sort of like the national conservative conception of what's good, right? And I am skeptical of this statement basically like overturning, you know, what's in the hearts and minds of the people. Like, you know, like NatCons want everyone to be like maybe a Christian or social conservative and start families, but I'm not really sure if that can be done through the state, at least as the primary sort of vehicle for that. But I would grant them that maybe the society will become, you know, more, you know, conservative and align with their beliefs, but that would happen that could perhaps happen organically. Maybe the great mass of people start becoming disillusioned with liberal society and like they start agreeing with some of those critiques of liberalism we said earlier about how like liberalism is maybe aimless or doesn't provide direction. Maybe people want like religion, or maybe people want community and identity. But I'm skeptical that the state can be the champion of that, because people will see that as an infringement of their freedom, and they think that, you know, they're basically being forced to do something that they didn't have a choice in.
Yeah, though ironically, if that were to happen, that shows the power of persuasion and participation in liberal politics. You're right, it wouldn't be through the state. It would be through NatCons presenting their arguments to the people and the people deciding that that makes the most sense for how they ought to live and them adopting it. And for all their, you know, ideas and gestures towards sort of like radicalism or rupture from liberalism, it does seem that the path towards them really cementing their ideas would ironically be through winning in the liberal system with the current rules as they are. And I think on that note, I think we might have broken our 30-minute promise to our listeners.
By a bit.
Yeah, the 30 minutes, that's more of a broad sort of, more of a broad goal than a promise.
It's a general idea.
Exactly.
We had concepts of a plan.
Exactly. We have concepts of a plan, and we think that's good enough. But thank you all for listening. I am very excited to start this series, and we have a bunch of interesting stuff to talk about in the future. Our next episode is going to be on national conservative political positions. Like, you know, we've been talking about the broad scale of like what they believe, like philosophically, but what do they believe on a more like day-to-day basis? You know, like trade, immigration, labor, social policies and stuff like that. I'm really excited to put out that episode and have that conversation with you, Mohammed.
Yeah, as am I. Yep. So Join us next time. Join us next week for episode 2, National Conservative Political Positions. This is Mohammed signing off.
And this is Jackson signing off. We'll see you all next week.